Hello, and welcome to today's Real Story Group briefing, the 2017 Marketing Technology and Employee Experience Vendor Map. What does it mean? I'm Tony Byrne, founder of Real Story Group, and it's great to have you on board with us today. This is a topic that I'm really passionate about. We first released this map in 2008. I think this is version 16 or so. We update it twice a year. We've become somewhat famous for this map, which you'll see in a moment. You can download your own copy of it. But the idea is not just to chart the vendor landscape, but also to sort of interpret it and help you understand what are some of the trends and what's going on. What does this all mean for you? So in the next half hour or so, that's what we're going to do. Now, those of you who are on the session today, on the briefing today, you'll all receive a PDF of this full briefing in the next 48 hours or so. Those of you whose enterprises, whose employers subscribe to Real Story Group Research, you'll also get access to a full on-demand video recording that you can share with your colleagues. Okay, so let's get into it. We know that several of you on the line today are new to Real Story Group, so I'll give you just a little bit of background. We're a research and analyst firm for early stage technology decision-making. Our core offering is our vendor evaluations, very detailed vendor evaluations across the MarTech and EmpEx landscape, where we analyze vendor weaknesses and strengths for your unique situations. We also have a benchmarking application to benchmark your digital effectiveness. And for our subscribers and others, we advise and mentor on successful technology decision-making, particularly around product selection. So that sounds a little bit like a traditional analyst firm like Forrester or Gartner, but we're actually quite different. Perhaps most importantly, we only work on the buy side, which means we only work for customers like you. So we never consult with vendors, we never speak at their events, we never go on their junkets, we don't write white papers for them, they can't quote us in their press releases. And what this has done is allowed us to, first of all, cover a lot more vendors, cover open source options, but also cover with real independence, right? So our research is known for being, I would say, the hardest hitting in the industry. So if you really want the real story on what's going on with these tools, we're the place to come for it. And we cover a variety of different technologies. And we, again, in 2008, we decided, well, the best way to try to do this is to make a kind of a vendor subway map, metro map, tube map, whatever you want to call it, showing these different marketplaces and how they intersect and diverge. So the key here in the lower right shows you the different color coding. So we've covered web content and experience management since the early days. The pink line is digital and media asset management. The red line is enterprise collaboration and social technology. This purple line running through the middle is marketing automation, campaign, and lead management. The somewhat shorter green line is enterprise portals and integration platforms, still kicking out there, important in certain verticals. The rather long brown line is the ECM, or enterprise content management and cloud file sharing. And then new this year is the orange line, customer relationship management, or CRM. So we have hard-hitting evaluations that across each one of these marketplaces that help you evaluate and compare these vendors head to head. But what's more interesting, I think, is to, at least for now, is to sort of drill down and take a look at what's actually going on here. What are the changes to this map, and what does this all mean? So let's get into that. I think the first thing to recognize is that certain things haven't really changed over the years, and it's important to notice that. What are some of the continuities? Because I think that helps you in some of your long-term planning. What are some of the fixed stars or constant trends that you can count on that allow you to then project forward and make some plans and strategies with a little bit more confidence? So here are some kind of overarching themes that we've been seeing really for the past several years. The first is there's a genuine center versus periphery here. So in the center, you have some big name vendors, IBM, Microsoft, Oracle. In the periphery, you've got a variety of different smaller, often point solutions. And so what this means is that this whole kind of bifurcation, in particular kind of suite vendors versus best of breed, that's been a persistent pattern across almost all of these marketplaces, with maybe one exception that I'll get into in a minute. And so as a customer, you really have a choice. Do I get a number of different tools from a single vendor, or do I go out there and go best of breed? This has never been a particularly easy answer for any of us to call. I think it's very situational. One of the things, though, that we're seeing, I think, is a little bit of a backlash against the suite vendors, certainly in the digital marketing and customer engagement segments, with this notion that they're not really as well integrated as customers might have liked. Many of these tools acquired through acquisitions, and that really going with vendor often isn't really all that much different than going best of breed. Seeing a little bit of a backlash against that as well on the digital workplace side, although obviously Microsoft, formerly with SharePoint and now with Office, still has an incredible centrifugal force in that marketplace. There's also some tension between new versus old technologies. So you've got a number of new interesting players like Slack, built natively in the cloud, and then obviously some older players, including surprisingly Salesforce, which has somewhat older technologies across some of its platforms. And so, there's obviously some tension here. New usually sounds good, isn't always ideal. There's something about the continuity and the reliability that comes with an established vendor, but also there are issues around technical debt and the sometimes increasing interest rate on that technical debt. You also have notions of products versus platforms, products being very out of the box, platforms being highly customizable. I'll talk about that again in a minute, because that's, again, a persistent trend in terms of the choices that you have. And finally, there's cloud native versus cloud enabled. So this is a little bit of a riff on the new versus old. Systems that were actually built for the cloud versus sort of established technology bases that were then cloud enabled, or essentially retrofitted into the cloud. And this has some significant implications around business models, performance, all kinds of other issues. But perhaps the even more important trends that we've seen as a constant across this is pervasive fragmentation. So fragmentation is kind of analyst speak for there are a heck of a lot of vendors in almost all these marketplaces. And on the whole, this has been a good thing. We think this has driven a lot of innovation. It has helped, in some cases, keep costs down, and has given you good choices, sometimes confusing choices. There's still some regional variations and regional differences. In some cases, you'll see vendors that are stronger in EMEA than North America, or focus more stronger on Asia Pac, so on and so forth. So many of the smaller players in particular today sometimes have a regional footprint. But even more than that, we see a lot of variation in terms of business model, in terms of licensing, the channel model, how they deal with things like tenancy and cloud-based hosting, whether they include services as part of the mix. And then this whole riff on product versus platforms is, the complexity and the richness, and what's the sweet spot in terms of ease versus richness that the vendor pursues. So there's a lot of variation out there and a lot of choices for you. On the whole, that's a good thing, although sometimes it can be kind of vertigo-inducing in terms of maybe too many choices and a desire to want to simplify things. And of course, that's really probably our core offering, is to help you simplify and streamline your choices and make good choices. But the other interesting thing that we've always seen is some boundary overlap. In other words, we make these neat distinctions between what's a web content management system versus what's a portal, what's a social platform versus collaboration, what's an asset management system versus a content management system. And in the real world, it's a little bit messier than that. And that's not a bad thing, that there are some vendors who straddle different marketplaces, certain tools that could be, multi-purpose. But as a customer, you need to be careful to make sure you know exactly what it is that you're buying and that it actually fits what your actual need is. So these are some kind of ongoing themes, and I'm going to just drill down on a couple of them here. So first, there still very much is a town center. Major vendors with multiple products, or in the case of Microsoft, maybe just Office and Dynamics CRM making up most of the stations here. IBM with a whole plethora of tools. OpenText getting larger with each passing season, mostly by acquiring aging technologies from other vendors. And so these players still very much dominate these marketplaces, at least in terms of mind share. I think we're seeing with each passing year, to some extent, some greater customer frustration as well. that some of these tools aren't as well integrated as perhaps they would have liked, and there are costs to going with a single vendor if in an agile environment I want to be able to adapt quickly and deliver the best possible tools to my colleagues. And if something that the vendor provides isn't really best of breed, then I've got a gap there between potential and the reality of my situation. And so, this has always been a tricky choice. I think the market is leaning a little bit away. And these vendors, of course, are fighting back. They're obviously making substantial investments in the cloud. And then one big area where they're really pushing is around AI, artificial intelligence, machine learning, and other cognitive tools, where they all have their own platforms around AI in particular that they're trying to amortize across all of their different tools and products and streams. So this is an area where a large vendor can make a significant R&D investment and then try to extend that investment across multiple different tools in a way that sometimes smaller vendors can't do quite as easily. So this is something that obviously they're trying to compete on with some success, at least as far as mind share. I think what our subscribers are telling us is that very often these are more like AI toolkits and not actually finished, polished applications. And so their customers are kind of teaching them how to do this at some level in a productized way. So it's not clear to me that even though putatively this is a benefit of going with a larger vendor or potentially a competitive advantage, the reality of that advantage may not be quite as vivid as you might like. But if you take those out of the equation, it's important to still remember that, there's a whole host of other tools out there. There's this incredibly broad marketplaces, particularly around social collaboration, WCM, ECM, DAM, and so forth, where, you've got a variety of smaller players and nobody who really has kind of dominant market share. And so again, on the whole, I think this has been very good for customers. We have seen some vendors exit some of these marketplaces, some pain around working sometimes with smaller or less mature vendors. But on the whole, I think we've seen greater innovation and flexibility and a wide range of cost value ratios so that you can kind of figure out where am I on the TCO spectrum at some level. In other words, some of these tools are more expensive and potentially richer, others are cheaper and potentially less extensible. And so that's choice. And on the whole, we believe choice is good for you. The other thing we did with the map this year was try to make a little bit of a horizontal bifurcation where kind of north of the center line was focused a little bit more on customer digital experience, and then below the line focused a little bit more on employee digital experience or digital workplace. That's a little bit easier said than done because, of course, you can still use the web content management system in a workplace environment. Same thing with digital asset management if it's being used for creative operations. And likewise, you can use portals and document management systems, which would normally be below the line. You can use those for customers as well. So this kind of customer versus workplace line, it's not totally neat, but in general, we tend to see ECM and portals and enterprise collaboration sort of more in a workplace setting, and the other technologies used more in a customer setting. There's obviously overlap then in the middle where some of these players have tools that can nominally be used on either side of the equation. Although it's interesting, what we find is that very often the same tool set that's designed for one often doesn't work well in the other environment. Of course, the classic example of that is Microsoft SharePoint, which never really took off as an external facing utility with the exception of some limited extranets. So I think what we're seeing more is a kind of a method, I would say a method flow from north to south. That is that some of the innovations in terms of methodologies and approaches and features coming out of the customer experience world find their way into the workplace world. I'd love to believe that this long-held belief that we, or aspiration that we all wanted consumerization. consumerization of workplace technologies. I'd love to believe that this is really happening. it is happening, but very, very slowly. Among our subscribers, some of the things that we're talking about more is like adapting some of the methodologies and some of the approaches from customer digital and take it down into the employee experience environment. And so in that vein, we put together what we call the EmpEx list. So these are 200 products from 135 vendors. You can download this at realstorygroup.com/EmpEx. And these are trying to look at what are the major technologies that an employee, particularly a knowledge worker, is likely to use throughout their day. So a big one obviously is in the green area, collaboration and communication. Purple is self-service and learning and employee development, and then human capital management and other major lines of business. So, among these now, these are the vendors and the tools that essentially, whether we like it or not, are shaping our employee experience. Particularly if you're using sort of cloud-based solutions, which may not be heavily customizable, you're essentially, outsourcing your experience to that particular vendor. So, this tells us a variety of different things. First, that in the digital workplace, your colleagues may be touching a number of different tools, but also, these are very large marketplaces, right? They're large, fragmented marketplaces, and there's a variety of different tools that you need to stay on top of if you're going to be a digital workplace expert. But having said all that, we really, in sort of our own conversations with large enterprise digital leaders, workplace leaders, is to look at this a little bit differently. To say, well, let's look at this kind of a little bit like a mall where you have some anchor services. And some of these services are really important. You've got to get them right? Like collaboration, enterprise social networking, HR and self-service applications, line of business tools for salespeople and marketers, groupware, which would be like instant messaging, communications, email, so on and so forth. You've got to get those right. And then you can experiment with some of the boutiques around them to then add to that experience and make your colleagues more successful, right? So it's this notion of kind of having anchors in your digital workplace. And then you can work on things like ideation, translation management, project management, search. Some of these which are clearly very, very important, but they kind of hinge on doing this other stuff that you see in the light blue really well. And so one of the conversations we're having is, do you have the right tools as anchors? And if you can get those right, then that gives you a lot more agility and freedom to then experiment with some of the more boutique-y, specialized offerings, which to be sure can be very differentiating in between. When you're looking at that, then suddenly sort of products versus platforms becomes important. So platforms are things that developers, someone who's expert in the tool, can make custom applications, and products do certain things really well right away. Now, platforms are richer, more customizable, more extensible, but they're also more complex, they're more resource intensive, and typically more costly. And that's the part often the vendors don't tell you about. Products, on the other hand, tend to be cheaper, less complex, less resource intensive, but they may not have the customizability and extensibility that you'd like to really differentiate. They may not have the feature richness. In other words, even with a lot of time and money and expertise, sometimes using a simple product means that just hearing the answer, no, our system doesn't do this, right? And so many multi-tenant software as a service offerings are products. More of the platform as a service offerings tend to be, of course, more platform-like and customizable. There's no simple answer here, but as we look at our vendor map, this is another way of kind of slicing and dicing, right? Because on the vendor map, a station is just a station. But if you look at some of these marketplaces, there's actually a real complexity spectrum. Example of that would be the enterprise collaboration social networking landscape. That's the red line on our vendor map. It turns out that there's a whole spectrum of technologies here, and we're not making any value judgments that one is better than the other, but it's important to sort of understand that some are going to take significant investments because they're platforms, and others are going to be simpler, more out-of-the-box products. So from left to right here, you have platform vendors, major suites that sometimes compete and can even at some level replace some of these platforms, although often they just supplement them. Smaller suites, which are particularly good in particular for smaller and mid-sized businesses. You see sort of intranets in a box here. Social enterprise layers and enterprise social networks, very important, we would argue, an essential element in the digital workplace landscape. And then, of course, various specialized players. We list a couple there, Harmony and Slack, but that list could go on and on and on, as you saw from the different sort of boutiques in the mall. So there's a complexity spectrum, and it's really important to sort of place yourself on the spectrum. And you may indeed need multiple tools here, but you need to understand what are the resources that I need to actually deploy these tools effectively, and how developer intensive in particular is it going to be. And to the extent that it's developer intensive, what sort of operational capacity do I need to be really effective with that? So what we're doing here is taking the two-dimensional map of the vendor map of the red line and sort of saying, okay, well, some of these tools are actually more complex and richer than others. There's a similar thing north of the center line. If we look at the MarTech or customer-facing digital world as well, is that there's anchors here, and you've got to get these anchors right. We would argue particularly around things like asset management, web content and experience management, CRM, marketing automation or email, essentially outbound, and of course analytics, increasingly important. Now, depending on what vertical you're in, some of these may be more important than others. If you're a manufacturing firm versus, say, a knowledge-based consulting firm, then some of these anchors may be different. But here again, this idea, if you get the basics down here, particularly you'll notice a lot of this is around data and content automation and analytics. If you've got that humming and you've got that working well, that then allows you to experiment with a whole wide variety of different tool sets that could ultimately make you more effective and could be sort of digital differentiators for your enterprise. Here again, there's a complexity spectrum. This is the web content and experience management environment, which we divide into platforms and products. You've got the most complex platforms over here on the left, and mid-range platforms, mid-range products, simpler products. So this is essentially, again, a left to right complexity spectrum. What's interesting about this, if you look at the red line, that sort of divides where you need an in-house developer and where you don't. And what we're seeing across this is generally the tools getting more complicated. So as of 2017, we're actually renaming mid-range products to lower end platforms. So they are simpler and less expensive, but they're still platforms where ideally you would have an in-house developer who's working, at least one developer who can customize these platforms to really make them work effectively for you. I think a great example of that is WordPress, where you can download a plain vanilla implementation, but very quickly you find that you need a WordPress guru. The other thing that's happening in this marketplace is some of the legacy players over here on the left are really disappearing from the marketplace and not really competing here, which we haven't seen so much in some of the other marketplaces, but a really interesting phenomenon of kind of almost a kind of an exit of the WCM marketplace of some of the traditional name players. New this year for Real Story Group is to cover customer relationship management. Of course, this is not new technology at all. In fact, it's one of the older lines on the subway map. And it's very interesting marketplace. At the large enterprise level, there's really only kind of 8 dominant vendors. Once you get into small and mid-sized businesses, of course, there's dozens, maybe even hundreds of CRM platforms. But at the enterprise level, it's a somewhat smaller, almost kind of oligopoly here. The big bananas, of course, are Microsoft, SAP, and Salesforce, to a lesser extent, Oracle. But Sugar, Pega, and Infor in particular, very significant niches in this marketplace. One of the interesting things about these CRM tools at this level is that they're almost all platforms. They almost all require someone who's really a guru on that platform, ideally a really experienced guru, ideally a developer, and maybe more than one developer, often then bringing in external third-party modules and custom extensions to do it. So these are somewhat developer-intensive platforms. Some interesting trends also going on in this as vendors really have been struggling over the last couple of years to address technical debt, to try to realign what they're doing on the marketing side, and to catch up a little bit on some of the services-oriented pieces, which they have neglected a little bit as they pursue some of the more sales-oriented CRM services. So a very broad marketplace, a number of different tools and different types of clouds within it, but very significant differentiation among the vendors. So if CRM is an area where you're examining your own investments, I'd certainly encourage you to get in touch with us. Haven't said much about digital asset management, but it's also a marketplace in transition. 30 some odd vendors that we cover. Some of them, again, can be geographically somewhat oriented. In other words, sort of maybe a strength in EMEA or a strength in North America and some weakness on the other side of the oceans, but also great difference in terms of size and approach to the cloud, and also, of course, their scenario orientation. What's interesting about digital asset management, even maybe more so than any other subway line than perhaps ECM, is that the vendors often have a strong vertical or industry orientation as well. So in our own evaluation research, that's one of the things that we weigh, is how strong a particular tool is in your particular industry. And this really addresses a lot of what can be very industry specific workflows and opportunities and constraints that play out particularly in BAM in ways that they might not when it comes to, say, marketing automation or web content and experience management. Also a little bit of a bifurcation in this marketplace between those who are really focusing on kind of core information management and those that are really trying to empower more the marketing function. Those are related, but also somewhat distinct use cases. Some vendors really focused more on one versus the other. So again, really important, as in any technology, to understand what you're trying to do from a scenario perspective before you wander into this marketplace and start identifying what's the right technology for you. So let's turn to that whole subject. What is the right technology for you? And we believe that there's a very specific approach that you should take, which is quite different from the traditional waterfall approach, where you spend an inordinate amount of time trying to document requirements and spreadsheets and then quickly rush to make a decision. Instead, we suggest a more agile approach that's team-based, very test-oriented, gets you hands-on sooner, and it's iterative and adaptive, right? So you can learn as you go and make the right choices based on actual experience as opposed to guesswork. So obviously you can start out and should start out with a longest shortlist, maybe even as many as 10 to 12 vendors in some of these segments. It's not unreasonable to do that level of investigation. Then you can use different filtering to get down to a shorter list of RFP recipients. As a research firm, obviously we're big believers in the value of research to help you get there. We're also still big believers in RFPs. They have kind of a bad rap, but we believe that if they're done right, based on actual narrative stories and journeys, that they can actually be quite effective. After that, you want to filter down to maybe 3 or 4 vendors to bring in to do demos. Again, not their canned demos, but actually your stories and journeys. And then perhaps most importantly is always, always, always do a bake-off of 2 finalists where you actually get hands-on with the tools. This is the most important thing you can do, and probably the biggest mistake in enterprise technology selection is not getting hands-on with the technology and actually simulating what life is going to be like actually using this technology before you buy it. Instead, what we find very often is organizations relying on these sorts of mystical quadrants, sort of a horse race thing: who's ahead, who's behind, what's hot, what's not. And I understand the value of these sorts of charts, but this is really no way to make a solid decision. You can try out at Real Story Group an alternative at realstorygroup.com/tools, what we call a real quadrant, which is a shortlist generator where you filter according to specific criteria and things that you're interested in particular, what scenarios are important to you, and key vendor and geographic intangibles. And then you see a weighted real quadrant that's actually customized for you and not some generic sort of leaderboard. So if you want to try that out, I encourage you to go ahead and do that. The important thing, though, is that after you get to a short list is, again, to get hands-on with the technology. This is one of the services that we provide to our subscribers, is to help them review their RFPs and their demo strategies and their POCs to make sure that you're following best practices and coming up with the right fit for your organization. Okay, so that was a pretty rapid fire half hour. I encourage you, if you haven't already, to download a free sample at realstorygroup.com/try, see some of our research. If you have any questions at all about what you saw today or about what's going on in these marketplaces, feel free to reach out to us. 16 of the Fortune 20 have used our research. I believe all 4 of the big 4 use our research to help their clients transform digitally. So I encourage you to think about whether our research would be a good fit for the sort of decision making that you have going forward. In the meantime, I wanted to thank you for participating today and wish you well in your digital initiatives. Until next time, this is Tony Byrne for Real Story Group. So long.